Hey friends, Pastor Bill Walden here with Build Up the Church. Build up the church. This is a devotional word for August 17th, 2024. We are now in the book of 1 Corinthians, chapter 1. Paul founded this church. He was the pastor there for a year and a half. Corinth was a city of great culture, great business, but also great vice, great immorality. Kind of like New York City meets San Francisco meets Los Angeles meets Las Vegas. You can get rich there and you can find terrible things whereby you may gratify yourself in the most sinful, licentious, immoral ways. And so the church at Corinth, they had it was a tough environment to live in, but they were there. They were thriving. As a church, we're going to see as we go through this book that they were gifted, very gifted in spiritual gifting. They were gifted in knowledge, gifted in the ability to communicate the gospel, but they were terribly carnal, terribly immature. And this book is really a book about a lot of correcting of these Christians and the correcting of the church activities and theology. And so Paul spends a lot of time here correcting them. We have 1st and 2nd Corinthians, but there was actually a letter written before 1st Corinthians. So we might say 1st Corinthians 1a and 1st Corinthians is 1st Corinthians 1b. Then there was another letter that we don't have, which would be 2a, and then 2nd Corinthians 2b. So we have the second and the fourth letters. The first and the third we do not have, but we can infer that they were written and understand that they were written by the textual criticism and examination of the two letters that we do have. So it seems as though the Corinthians were being very enamored by the Greek culture in Corinth. Corinth really valued philosophy, oratory, high thinking, high presentations, lofty speech, that kind of thing. And there was a temptation there for the Corinthians to water down the message of the cross or to think that in order to be effective in the preaching of the gospel message, they needed to present it without the offensive parts and embellish it with the things that the Corinthian culture would approve of. And the Apostle Paul said, no, that's not what you do, not what you do at all. So two verses for us here. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18 and 19. Let me read it to you, then we'll come back and dive into them. Paul says this, the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. Verse 19, for it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise. This is what God says. I will destroy the wisdom of the wise and bring to nothing the understanding of the prudent. And so, first thing, verse 18, the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. In our culture in 2024, we might think the message of the cross, so we have a necklace or we have a cross stitched onto our Bible or something like that. But we have to remember that in the first century, the cross was the most gruesome way to execute someone. Beheading would be infinitely more humane, or strangulation, or any other number of things. But crucifixion could take hours and sometimes days for a man to die. It was humiliating. The people were crucified naked. They were nailed to a crossbar and an upright. The birds of the air could come and begin to tear their bodies apart. Wild animals could tear at them. We often think of somebody on a cross being elevated very high, but very possibly and probably the feet of the victim were only 1 or 2 feet off the ground. And so, dogs or wild animals could come and begin to devour them while they were still alive. Roman citizens would never be crucified. They only reserved that only for traitors, Roman traitors, and for non-Romans. And so it was the worst way to die. So let me paraphrase that, and we'll see why the message of the cross was foolishness to a group of people. Let me paraphrase it. For the message of the electric chair is foolishness to some people. The message of death by hanging is foolishness to some people. Some people would say, you're telling me I should follow somebody that was killed in an electric chair and they're my Savior? You're telling me that I should follow somebody that was hanged by the neck until they were dead, and they're my Savior? And Paul is saying, I will not minimize, I will not water down the gospel message. Jesus Christ, the Savior of the world, God in the flesh, put on flesh and allowed himself, and in fact ordained that he would be crucified. And unless you see the spiritual significance in that, it seems like foolishness. And Paul admits this. The message of the cross is foolishness to who? To those who are perishing. Now we're going to see two verbs here in verse 18, and they're both in the present tense and continual, I should say. The message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing and continually working their way towards perishing. But to us who are being saved, not just to us who are saved, but to us who are being saved. So a Christian is both saved and being saved. Not that justification is incomplete when a person says yes to Jesus, but there is the work of sanctification, there is the work of healing, there is the work of transformation. Justification is not just about having a not guilty verdict, but it's about having a life transformed. And so the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. Don't be surprised or offended that when you talk about Jesus Christ to your friends, they think you're out of your mind. It says they're perishing. And if they think you're out of your mind, it indicates that they are perishing, sadly. But to us who are being saved, we realize that's the power of God. Jesus died on that cross to forgive me of my sins. That's God's power to forgive me of my sins and to change my life. So there's two groups in the world, those who are perishing and those who are being saved. Verse 8:19, for it is written, and this is what God says, this is a God perspective, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, or I will destroy the so-called wisdom of the wise, and bring to nothing the understanding of the prudent. In other words, this, God is not against education, God is not against lofty thinking, God is not against philosophy, God is not against a great oratory and great speakers and great debate, unless those things tell us that the cross is foolishness and that man can save himself through his own efforts. In that condition, or in that case, God would say, you'll see that your so-called wisdom is not wisdom at all, but it's actually foolishness. The Lord prefers that we not be foolish in our own estimation of Jesus Christ. But I always encourage people, if you are the slightest bit curious about who Jesus was and is and ever shall be, may I invite you, may I encourage you, get a Bible, start reading the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Let Jesus speak for himself. Many people have gone from thinking the cross was foolishness to seeing and understanding that the cross is the power of God to salvation. So some things to think about.